The beginning and the end of any section of the Torah is always linked. And our spiritual service of Hashem is always linked between what the Eibishter inspires us with, what's called Isirusa de Le'ela, and what we respond with in terms of our efforts, called Isirusa de L'Sata, which is where the real power lies, as we're about to discover. It's been explained numerous times that any concept within Torah has a unique connection between its beginning and its end. As the Sefer Yetzirah, the famous book of Kabbalah, teaches us, that the end is wedged into the beginning, and the beginning is linked and wedged in with the end. And so this must also apply to the Torah Tanakh. That there's always a link between the beginning and the end of each book within Tanakh and each parasha within the Torah. So let's look at ours, because we're now talking about concluding the third book of the Torah. So therefore, in our parasha Bechukosai, so the end of our parasha is not only the end of the parasha, but it's Hein the Sefer Vayikra is the conclusion of the book of Vayikra. Ve'Hein the parasha is Bechukosai, and obviously the end of the parasha is the end of the parasha. So we're going to have to conclude Sheshna Nukudim Meshotefes Ben Aschola Sefer Vayikra. We'll have to discover a shared theme between the beginning of the book of Vayikra and Hascholas Parashas Bechukosai, the beginning of the book of the parasha Bechukosai, V'Soif Parashas Bechukosai, and the end of Bechukosai, which links both, of course, to the beginning of this parasha itself and all the way back to the beginning of the book of Vayikra. We're going to see something which is fascinating. When you have a look at Likutei Torah and you see how the Alter Rebbe explains the beginning of Sefer Vayikra and the beginning of Parshas Bechukosai, which is the Parasha Chassidus de Shavua Seilu, the Chassidish parasha for these weeks, Mizborer Heitev, it's very clearly portrayed, how both of the beginnings of each, the book of Vayikra and the parasha Bechukosai, notes the parasha, how what they represent is a shared theme that is linked to the end of this parasha and by extension the end of the book of Vayikra. So now we're going to see this concept that the end is wedged back into the beginning, not only as it plays out in the written Torah, but even in the Chassidus on the parasha. Because the themes that are explained as the Chassidus on the beginning of Parshas Bechukosai and the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, is linked in and explained in the Likutei Torah for the end of Bechukosai. So it all really links together. And not only that, what's really surprising, if you know the structure of Torah, of Likutei Torah, you'll see that it's really surprising how this works. Because if you're looking in the Torah itself, the end of Parshas Bechukosai is naturally the end of Sefer Vayikra. What's interesting is in Likutei Torah, after the Alter Rebbe concludes Parshas Bechukosai, there are other ma'amorim that are included as well. And even at the end of those additional ma'amorim, it comes back to the same theme, which is really relevant to Parshas Bechukosai and by extension the beginning of Vayikra, illustrating clearly that there's a link and a loop between the beginning and the end, not only in Torah but in Chassidus as well, of what these parashas represent. And we are going to unpack what it is with a beautiful message for us. So what is the connection? The obvious link between the end and the beginning, when I'm looking at the book of Vayikra. So the obvious link between the conclusion of Vayikra and the beginning of Vayikra is that Sefer Vayikra Pasech B'dina Karbonos. How did Vayikra begin? With the general introduction and the specifics of various karbonos that a person would bring. Adam ki yakrim mekem korban l'Hashem b'goyim, as the pasuk says, when a person amongst you will bring a korban. And then when you get to the end of the book of Vayikra, it also talks about karbonos, two specifically. It talks about two specific kinds of karbonos, namely aleph bechor, that a person has to tithe the firstborn of every flock of animals as a korban to Hashem. And Beis Ma'aser Behema, that you then count all the animals, and every 10th animal is also given as well. So out of all the karbonos, which are the two that are listed at the end of Vayikra, Bechor and Ma'aser? So we're going to realize from this, somehow these two karbonos, they represent everything about all of the karbonos which were introduced at the beginning of Vayikra. So if we understand what Bechor and Ma'aser are all about, we'll have a great insight into what karbonos are all about. So let's understand it. Let's first distinguish what's the difference between Bechor and Ma'aser. And we're going to see that there's a very clear distinction, and this clear distinction will speak to the theme of what we're going to learn together. Shabachor kadosh me'atzmoi. The firstborn animal, by virtue of the fact that it is a firstborn animal, is automatically holy. It belongs to Hashem via the Kohanim. It's the Eibishter who decided that this animal would be born first and therefore is holy. We don't have to do anything to allocate it to be holy. Whereas the Ma'aser Behema is the exact opposite. It's completely dependent on us. We have to count all the animals, and then we have to either say or mark the 10th animal that this is the holy animal. So Bechor is Hashem's work, and Ma'aser is our work. There's a powerful theme. This actually plays out in modern times in a very clear way, because the idea that a firstborn animal is holy exists even today, because it's a natural, automatic process. Doesn't require a Beis Hamikdash, doesn't require a pedigree of Kohanim, and doesn't require an action on our behalf, so it still applies today. Whereas practically there is no concept today of tithing 1 out of every 10 animals to be given to the Kohanim. Because the Chachamim made a gezerah that in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, we don't separate Ma'aser Behema. So that just illustrates clearly Bechor is completely out of our hands, and therefore it doesn't depend on us, and it happens at all times in all situations. Whereas Ma'aser Behema is very much about us, whether we can or can't do the Havodah. That also helps us to understand the order in which they are presented. Obviously, we're going to first describe the Bechor in the pasuk, and then we'll talk about Ma'aser, because it's logical. Because what are karbonos all about? From the root word karov, it's about coming closer to Hashem. It's an avodah that we do in order to bring ourselves closer to Hashem. There are 2 steps. First step is first there is the inspiration and the injection of holiness that the Eibishter gives us, represented by the Bechor, which is holy because Hashem said so. And only after we've been stimulated with that injection of holiness, then you get the possibility of us being able to draw ourselves closer to Hashem because we've been empowered. And that is represented by Ma'aser, where we do the action of designating a particular animal to be Ma'aser. So what do we see? The Eibishter has to start the process of creating holiness so that we could respond and use that holiness in our own avodah. That is what links the end of Vayikra, which talks about Bechor and Ma'aser, back to the beginning of Vayikra, about the general principle of a person bringing a korban and thereby coming closer to Hashem. Because the Alter Rebbe explains in the Torah, in addition to the obvious, that Adam Ki Akriv means a human being who brings a sacrifice to Hashem, the Alter Rebbe explains that the Alter Rebbe says that the unique choice of the word Adam, as opposed to, let's say, Ish or Gever, represents Adam Ha'elyon, the supernal man, which is indicative of Hashem, who is Mekarev Yakriv, who draws close, as Adam Shelamata Lelikus, Mikem Karban Gomer, who draws us, the humans, closer to himself. So that's exactly the point. The first step has to be that first there has to be an arousal from above. The Eibishter has to initiate contact. And that allows us humans the opportunity to be able to come closer to Hashem. And only after that, then the Torah can get into the details of what we do to respond. We actually take physical animals and we actually bring karbonos to do avodah, to move closer to Hashem after Hashem has initiated contact. That's talking about the animals that the human being brings through his own efforts. In addition to the physical animal that he puts onto the altar, also to work with the internal animal that he has and to refine it and elevate it and bring it closer to Hashem, which is Isarusa Dilasato, the process or the approach or the arousal that comes from a human being. So that's the summary of how our avodah works. First, Hashem has to stimulate and inspire us, and then we could respond and participate. And that fits perfectly with the two specific korbanos that are mentioned at the end of Parshas Bechukosai, which is the end of Sefer Vayikra. On the one hand, first you have Bechor, Kadosh Melamayla, the firstborn animal, which is designated as holy by Hashem's designation. And then following that, Meiser, which is Kadosh Alidei Ha'adam. You have the designation of 1 out of 10 animals, which a human being has to do through their calculations and their efforts. So now we have the template. Hashem starts spiritual processes, and we respond, and we then grow and develop and get close to Hashem. So based on these two concepts, Bechor, the firstborn animal, which represents Isarusa Dileila, the divine initiative. Or Meiser, and the 10th animal, which represents Isarusa Dilasata, human input. Kayomim Gam Be'odam Gufa, both of those play out in the human experience as well. In addition to Hashem's experience with us and our reciprocal experience, it actually plays out internally as well. HaBechor Echadhu. There can only be one firstborn per family. V'im yesh rabim harehu harishan. So if there are many, many animals that were born to this particular animal, the Bechor would have to be the first out of all of those animals. Now, spiritually, that represents V'zoi Bechinas Chochma. Out of all of the traits, all of the elements of the soul, all of the, what we call Koiches HaNefesh, the powers of the soul, Chochma, the ability to conceptualize a new idea, to be open to learning new information, the spark of innovation, that is the part of us. That's the first step in the entire process. There can only be one first step. So the first step of the entire process of the neshama is Chochma. This is aligned with what the Torah tells us, that we have to sanctify the firstborn. The idea of being sanctified, which is also the idea of being separate, is related to Chochmah. Chochmah is distinct from all other processes because it's where a person is essentially open to something which is beyond themselves. That's where does innovation come from? Where do ideas come from? Where does inspiration come from? It comes from beyond ourselves. So it's out of the box. V'ino Meiser, whereas Meiser, which is all about counting out 10 different animals and then selecting the last of the 10, that's kind dafka sheyeshna masara. In order to do Meiser, there have to be 10 animals, so that number 10 could be designated as Meiser. And that represents avodah mitzad eser koiches hanefesh. That represents how we serve Hashem using the full spectrum of the 10 abilities of our soul. Chochma, bina, das, chesed, gvura, tiferes, netzach, yesod, malchus. And the responsibility that we have is, even if we can't get our entire soul to be aligned as it should, at the very least, number 10, the lowest, the most expressive part of our neshama, needs to be aligned with what Hashem wants, which means the part of us that we express to the world, how we think, what we say, and the way in which we behave, that has to be sanctified. So even if we still have distractions and temptations, at the very least, our behavior, the 10th element, has to be kodesh. Like, for example, Alter Rebbe explains that a Beinoni who is not yet a tzaddik, and yet is the individual we could all access, we could all reach and aspire to become. What is the designation, what is the definition of a Beinoni? Maybe still has internal work to do, but that which is out in the practical world, thought, speech, and action, completely dedicated to Hashem. Knowing that Bechor represents Chokhmah, the beginning of the entire process of the neshama's faculties. And Meiser represents the final element of the soul's faculties, the ability to express ourselves into the world. So now we can understand, as we've already said, the Bechor is already holy because Hashem said so. It's not dependent on anything that we will do to cause it to be holy. That is reflective of the concept that Chokhmah within the soul, which as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya is koyach hamasiras nefesh, the capacity for a person to totally surrender themselves and sacrifice themselves for Hashem. That's not something we create for ourselves. Rather, yeshna b'kol echad mi'Yisrael b'yerusha me'avoseinu. As the Alter Rebbe explains extensively in Tanya, that is something we have inherited from our ancestors, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, and therefore it is part of who we are, like it or not. We don't create it, and we can't diminish it. Whereas Beis Kedushas Bechor, Beis, the second part about it is Kedushas Bechor Kayemes Gam Bizman Hagolus, as we learned earlier, even in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, Bechor is still a relevant Kedusha that has an application in our lives today, because Bechinas Chochma Anal Shebenefesh Kayemes Tamid B'Shleimus, because there is never a time in the Jewish experience where the Chochma dimension of the soul that allows a person absolute dedication to Hashem would ever be absent. Mashein Ken Kedushas Meiser, whereas by contrast, when you're talking about the designation of Meiser, which is Eser Koichas HaNefesh, that you go through the 10 soul faculties, Veho Asiri, and the 10th of those faculties, which is the translation of the internal work into how we live, our thought, speech, and action, that is not guaranteed because it's Tluya B'Avodas Ha'adam. That depends on what we do. So deep down inside, of course, we're always whole. But how do we behave in practice? That's our choice. Therefore, it will be a different experience at the time there's a Beis HaMikdash, which means when there is clear, revealed godliness in our reality. And that will be completely different. Is Mana Golos to the time of Golos. Golos is as a result of our Avera. So we're not behaving as we should. So clearly, of course, our thought, speech, and action are not pristine. They're not the way that they should be. So that again highlights for us the connection between the end of Bechukosai and the beginning. Because what is Bechukosai all about? When it comes to the pasuk that says at the beginning of our parasha that if you will keep my statutes, which Rashi says is really Amelim B'Torah, that you're very immersed in Torah, and you will guard the mitzvahs. So Mavur B'Likut Torah, the Alter Rebbe explains, according to Chassidus, Bechukosai Teilechu, not only do we emphasize the part of the word Bechukosai, but we also emphasize together. Bechukosai goes together with Teilechu, movement. Koi ala avoida dehiluch. It implies, says the Alter Rebbe, the kind of avodas Hashem which is constantly moving and upgrading, beli gvul, without any limits, without any restrictions. Where or how would a person reach that point that they could move in leaps and bounds consistently? That is mitzad b'chinas chakiko shebineshama. That is because of the element of the neshama where the reality of Hashem is completely ingrained. It is etched into the neshama. Bechukosai meleshon chakiko. The word Bechukosai is related to the word Chakika, engraving, and that refers to Shoresh HaNeshama Kfi Shechakuka L'mayla. That refers to the source of our neshama, which is completely engraved and one, because the point of engraving is that the material and the message are all one. So the Chakika of the neshama means the neshama and its source, which is Hashem, are absolutely one and indivisible. The only thing is, there we're describing how the neshama has this unlimited capacity for growth because of where it is rooted. But the reality is, we're living here on earth inside human bodies. So therefore, we have a problem. We don't have longevity. We're not able to sustain that kind of growth and power and enthusiasm. To borrow the wording of the Alter Rebbe there in Likutei Torah, it doesn't stand on its own 2 feet, and it's not sustainable. The only way that we could get that power of the neshama to be sustainable in our lives is we have to do something. We have to do our avodah. We have to do the mitzvahs. That will facilitate the power of our neshama being real in our lives. In other words, by performing mitzvahs here on earth, the person creates the viable conditions, the so-called structures within which it is possible to sustain and guard and guarantee that ongoing unlimited growth and upgrade, which is available to us because of where our neshama comes from. And again, to borrow the wording of the Alter Rebbe, that it should be in a way that that it is for the long term. So there are two factors over here. Our neshama's source is not our choice. It's not of our making. That's the Eibishter's gift to us that has chakika, complete oneness with Hashem, and therefore can have no barriers to its growth and opportunities. Practically, in order for that to happen for real in our lives, we have to do something. We have to have an Esarusa Dilasata, get involved in mitzvahs. Bechukosai Telechu is Hashem's gift. Mitzvosai Tishmeru is our response. So, Beis Inyonim Hanal, these two concepts. The incredible, infinite power of the neshama, which is a gift because of where it is sourced. And Beis Mitzvosai Tishmeru Mitzad Adam Lamata, the translation of that potential into reality by human choices as doing mitzvahs. That links, that's the beginning of Parshas Bechukosai, links perfectly with the end of Parshas Bechukosai, because you have Bechor, Chochma Shebenefesh, same concept. Chochma Shebenefesh means the indelible connection to Hashem that is implanted in our neshama, not by our choice, and that has to be balanced with Meiser as a Koichas HaNefesh, what we actually do with the 10 faculties of our soul, and most importantly, how it translates into thought, speech, and action. Now, Yedua Klal, we know Gemara in Brochas tells us that there's a principle, everything is defined by its concluding elements. So, out of the two, Bechor and Meiser, which represent two different elements of the divine human interaction, how does the parasha end? Not with Bechor, it specifically ends with Meiser. So, that leaves us no choice but to say, Meiser bo lachara Bechor, that Meiser follows Bechor loyrach mipnei shekachu seder ho inyonim, not just because that's the order of how things work. Shetchila bo isusa del'ela Bechor, that first is an arousal from Hashem, which is represented by the Bechor. V'achar kach avodas ha'adam Meiser, and then you have the human input, which is represented by Meiser. But actually wants to show us that there's an advantage to what we achieve through our efforts over what is achieved by Hashem giving us the greatest gifts. And therefore, because it turns out that actually our input is the chap, the goal, the highest aspiration of all of creation. Therefore, Hasiyum v'achosin to Sefer Vayikra hu binyan ha'Meiser. How does the book of Vayikra conclude? Dafka talking about Meiser. Kitachlis inin ha'karbonos avodas ha'adam, so as to illustrate to us that the ultimate purpose of all karbonos is to reach the point of human endeavor. And so therefore we can apply this principle back to the beginning of Vayikra and the beginning of Bechukosai as well. The fact that there is an awakening from us, that we bring a korban as described in Parshas Vayikra. And how did that happen? That was a response to and a result of the inspiration from on high. Adam ki Yaakov Gomer, as the Alter Rebbe explained. Adam Ha'elyon wants to reach out to us and create a channel of connection for us. So the fact that that's how it is presented, it's not just because, look, it wouldn't be a lasting, meaningful input if it was just Hashem doing all the work and we didn't pick up the slack. And eventually, in a relatively short period of time, the great inspiration from on high would wear off, as we've seen many times in our history. So it's because of the human frailty that we've also now got to get on track and start doing things of our own. Because that will consolidate the inspiration and the awakening from on high. And therefore it will be sustaining davar miskayim. So it's not just that. It's not just a practical thing, because people are fickle. And if you just keep pouring inspiration on them, it's not going to do anything until they actually start to work. It's not just that. It's not just a practical consideration. It's far more profound. That is how the process of continual growth and upliftment in spiritual matters works. It turns out that there's a spiritual advantage and greatness to the awakening that comes from below our efforts, which is even superior to what is introduced by Hashem's inspiration. So now we've got to understand this. We've already described that Bechukosai relates to the concept of Chakika, that the essence of the soul is absolutely one and innate with Hashem. And especially within Chakika, you could probably split hairs and say that there are different levels of how engraved something is. We're talking about the ultimate level of engraving, which is called Oisios Shebe'etzem Hanefesh, the so-called letters of holiness that are part of the essence of the soul, or to put it in different words, they are letters that are completely one with Hashem's infinite essence. As described in the Torah, what's relevant for our conversation is Bechukosai pretty much sounds like the highest level the neshama could possibly be at. And not only that, it's a Vechinas Alicha. Bechukosai Telechu, there's movement, there's growth, there's no limits. Okay, what could possibly be added to that? What possible additional value could there be in mitzvah tishmor that we turn it into our practical application of mitzvahs? So the explanation is binyan anal, what we've just touched on. That when there is tremendous input and inspiration from on high, that does not make it long-term sustainable. It will only be consolidated if it is followed by human endeavor. So Hashem can inspire us from here till the end of time. Until we start to do something, it's not consolidated. That's a principle that doesn't seem to make any sense. Because Yodua, one thing we know is when Hashem initiates a process without any, so to speak, attraction from us. In other words, we haven't done anything. Hashem chooses to stimulate a particular process. That indicates that it's nimshechas mimadrega kazoishaim b'tfisas makom l'maisa tachtonim. It's not that it's because Hashem preempted us and He figured He's not going to wait for us, so He'll just start the process. It's because Hashem wants to introduce an element into the system that is beyond our reach. We couldn't have stimulated that process. And so the description of how that is expressed is what we call chafetz chesed, because Hashem wants to share, because Hashem wants to be kind to us. So simple logic says now doesn't make any sense. If Hashem is gifting us with something that is from a level that is fundamentally beyond our reach, I mean, it is greater than not only what we could do, but greater than what we could imagine or experience. So how is it possible that is going to then be upgraded or elevated or assisted because of something we do? Logic says, just like this particular inspiration from Hashem didn't need to be introduced by our efforts, so in order to initiate that input from Hashem, surely by the same logic, you shouldn't need anything to ground it afterwards. In order to ground the awareness or the inspiration or the stimulation that came from on high, it didn't need us to get it started. It shouldn't need us to keep it alive. Okay, so then you'll say, well, the problem is not what the Eibush is giving. The problem is the recipient. We're people. People are fickle. People are weak. People are finite. Maybe that's the problem. Shamshochi Kanal, again, we've got to clarify what's happening over here. In the case of an Isarusa Dile'ela, that is not dependent on our input. It means that Hashem is giving from a level, Mimadrega Kozoi, She'ein Bot Tfisis Mokem Uchshivas Namaisa Tachtoinim, where our actions have no influence. That means not only are our actions not going to cause it to happen, it's not that we did something to deserve inspiration. It means the flip side is also true. There's nothing we could do to mess up that hamshacha, that input. It is purely Hashem's choice to share kindness with us, and nothing should be able to limit Hashem's abilities to share with us. So why do we have to ground it? The Alter Rebbe explains simply why this is. Because we're talking over here where a person becomes excited or inspired, and that's barak mitzad ha'yisusa dele'ela. Why is the person inspired? Because inspiration is pouring into them at this point. Hashem is actively inspiring these people. Not because they've shifted or grown or developed or moved in any meaningful way. Soon as that inspiration, that great divine input stops, because the Eibush only chooses it, the Eibush only shares it when he chooses to share it. It's like being unplugged, and all the stimulation and love of Hashem that was being generated by that particular input from on high is no longer there, because the input is no longer there. Let's explain this a little better. So towards the end of the Likutei Torah on our parasha, the Alter Rebbe explains on Maimer Azal, he references the mission in Pirkei Avos that says that if you want to avoid Aveirus, you have to know from where you come and where you are headed. On, because it says le'on, you're going to on Meira Mokim Gashmi. That refers to the physical space and reality. Whereas v'ayin al b'chinas chochma shelamayla mimokim. Ayin, as the pasuk says, v'chochma mi'ayin timotzei. Ayin represents that which can't be. It's intangible. It cannot be defined. Like chochma, which is completely beyond the concept of space, and even sometimes beyond the concept of understanding. So me'ayin, boss, it doesn't just mean where have you come from. It's giving us the answer right there. It says, where do you truly come from? Well, the source of your neshama is derived from a dimension that we will call ayin, meaning beyond anything we could comprehend or that we could define. When it says, where are you going to? That's referring to how Hashem will reward us in the future after the resurrection of the dead. Where will that happen? That's going to happen back in the physical world here on earth. So now ask the question. This doesn't seem to make any sense. Isn't it true that the entire reason the neshama entered this world, which is a descent, because the neshama was in a spiritual place and now it's locked into a physical reality, the entire purpose of that was that the neshama should attain a higher dimension, a higher experience. So therefore, how does it make any logical sense that after the neshama comes down into this world, detaching, in a sense, from its source, Sheresh HaNeshama, which is ayin, beyond time, beyond space, beyond definition, how could the reward, the ultimate state that it's now going to achieve, be on, which is Bechinas Mokim Shelamatami Ayin, the parameters and the restrictions of the physical reality? It doesn't make any sense, right? Surely you should go to a higher spiritual place. The Alter Rebbe explains, it's specifically by being in the physical environment, that's where we could achieve the ultimate state, which is a home for Hashem, where Hashem can be absolutely exposed without any restriction, dafka in the lowest, least likely place. Dafka kan lemata. It's specifically here in our lower reality, that's when Hashem's infinite light could be revealed. And from that perspective, there is no value to the spiritual over the physical, because there is no distinction between them. And that is that's even greater than the level of ayin, because at the level of ayin, spirituality is primary, and the physical has no real value. But at the level of oirein soif, giloy oirein soif, physical, spiritual is all the same. Or to put it into different words, kaloimar, dafka ba'avodas ha'adam, specifically through human endeavor in the physical world, nishlemes kavonas ha'atzmus, will we complete the intention and the driving force that the essence of Hashem wants to achieve, which is exponentially, infinitely higher and greater than even the spiritual realm called Chokhmah. Because the Eibishter had a desire, which means it's inexplicable. Why did he want it? Because he wanted it. What did he want? That the ultimate expression of absolute godliness should be in the lowest, most physical, most limited realm. As the Alter Rebbe concludes there, that refers to the spiritual level called Atika Kadisha, the Atiko Atainuk de Lemaila Nisava, which represents the deepest kind of pleasure imaginable, translated into the words of the Midrash Nisava, that the Eibishter desired a physical realm to accommodate Ein Sof godliness. Therefore, what is the reward for us achieving what Hashem wanted to transform our world into His accommodation? That must play out in the world. Mokim Gashmi, the physical space, because we well know that all reward plays out in the environment where the work was done. Where was the work done to create Hashem's so-called dream? Here on earth. So therefore, where is this reward going to play out? Here on earth. And now we can understand why the human effort elevates and outdoes the value and the power of that which comes milamaila, that which comes from the Isarusa Dile'ela. Because kol ha'amshachos milamaila bo'is me'oiros v'giloyim, anything that Hashem is going to share with us will be what we call giloyim, which means revelation. Anything that can be revealed, that can be shared, that can illuminate, has its limits. Could be greater revelation, lesser revelation, more light, less light. That means there are parameters and limits. But when we do what Hashem wants, that speaks the language of what the essence is looking for, the essence of Hashem. Hashem's essence and the intention that Hashem's essence has for our avodah in this world supersedes and is totally beyond even the level of chafetz chesed, free love from Hashem. Because that will also have its parameters and its limits. When it stops, it stops. So the bottom line is this. Our avodas Hashem reaches all the way to Hashem's essence, which can never shift, can never be defined, can never have moments. Therefore, because we're locked into the consistent, with a capital C, the only consistent reality, Hashem's essence, that creates sustainability for the inconsistent Isarusa Dile'ela, which if Hashem chooses to share, He will, and when it time's up, time's up. Now it consolidates because you're linked into Atzmos. It's not just because we work hard, so therefore we kind of grab onto Hashem's inspiration and keep it. We transform Hashem's inspiration from just being inspiration, that which is given, that which is shared, to being an expression of that which is absolutely constant, Hashem's essence. This will also explain parenthetically why the Alter Rebbe in the Torah at the beginning of Vayikra tells us, after he explains that it's only once humans employ and initiate their endeavor, that's when Hashem's inspiration is lasting. He says there, Adam ki yakriv. Where did the stimulation start from? That level called Adam ha'elyon, a defined, albeit very high level of godliness, but is defined as Adam. Where does our avodah reach? Lo Adamhu, the level of godliness that is beyond even the designation Adam. Speaking the language of what we've just described over here, which is that our avodah gives an upgrade to Hashem's Isarusa Dile'ela because it now plugs Hashem's Isarusa Dile'ela, which came from a lofty but nevertheless level, into the essence which is beyond levels. So kashem shekenu l'mayla, that's how it is in spiritual terms. Shataynik datzmus nisavu b'avoida dafka, that Hashem's desire, the desire of atzmus, of Hashem's essence, is specifically that we should do avoida in physical terms here on earth. Kameichan hu be'adam lemata, that actually translates into an experience that we could all relate to ourselves. As the Gemara tells us, a person would prefer a smaller amount of his own assets over something which is gifted to him from somebody else. Dafka. The nature of humans, how the Eibush has created us, is we much prefer, and we get much deeper pleasure out of the things we have worked to earn. Anything that is given to us as a free gift without effort on our part, so we don't get the same pleasure out of it because that reflects the fact that it doesn't really represent Hashem's pleasure. Because it's not really what the Eibishter chose as the source of his pleasure. Hashem didn't design the world so that it could shower us with gifts and we'd do nothing. So therefore we don't find real pleasure in just being given things for nothing. Dafka b'kav shaloi, specifically that which we work to earn. What a person had to invest in. That Adam roitze. That's what a person wants. And when we say that's what a person wants, we mean in an extremely deep level that speaks to the core value and the core pleasure that a person could ever have. And that is why you've got this link from the beginning and the end of a process. As we said right at the beginning, not only does the part that deals with Parshas Bechukosai speak to the same core theme as the beginning of Parshas Vayikra, but even the part that is after Bechukosai, the Hoysafos, which are on additional topics, link back to the same theme. In those Hoysafos, you'll see Shiyam HaKippurim talks about Yom Kippur, which is Shabbos Shabbosin, the ultimate Shabbos, and Chassidus has a beautiful insight to this. Represents the deepest, most innate pleasure that a person can have that doesn't need anything else to create pleasure for it. Which is a radical explanation of why we don't eat and drink on Yom Kippur. Not because it's just a time of inui that we're supposed to afflict ourselves, because we don't need these things to give us that tremendous pleasure in Hashem. The pleasure comes from within. Then from that we graduate to the holiday of Sukkot, which is a time of joy, or Shmini Atzeres, which is the ultimate holiday of the whole series. So that takes this great, incredible pleasure of Yom Kippur, which is a one day of the year, translates it into makif, the environment, like the sukkah that engulfs us, so it kind of engulfs us, until it eventually becomes something personal to us. That we should be able to live in a world where we're cognizant of Hashem, and we serve Hashem with absolute dedication, and with nefesh chafetza, a soul that wants to. Meaning, what does it mean, wants to do what Hashem wants? That means that the ultimate pleasure that a Jewish person has after Yom Kippur is over is, what's my ultimate pleasure? Doing what Hashem wants. Those words, nefesh chafetza, a willing or deeply pleasure-driven, but not God forbid, gashmistic pleasure. Those words, nefesh chafetza, that the soul has this tremendous will and pleasure, those are the last words of the Likutei Torah in this section. As is quite similar to the way he completes or concludes the Maimer on Parshas Bechukosai, where he talks about Atika Kadisha, which, as we explained before, Datik, which is the ultimate essence of Hashem's pleasure. Now, what we know is Sheshmini Atzeres hu Hashemen va'esensia nekudas atamtis l'chol chodesh Tishrei. Shmini Atzeres is considered like the oil, the essence, the pivot, the goal, the apex of the entire experience of the Yomim Tovim of Tishrei. Which leads us to say that the enthusiasm and desire and passion and will and pleasure that a person has from Torah mitzvahs, as represented by Shmini Atzeres, is even superior to the deepest tainug expressed on Yom Kippur that doesn't need any moving parts in order to satisfy it. So that doesn't automatically resonate with us, because how is it possible that the pleasure of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, where you do eat and you do drink and you celebrate with meat and with wine, how could that possibly supersede the greatness of Yom Kippur and the pleasure of Yom Kippur, where we're beyond eating and drinking? So how do you graduate from being beyond eating and drinking to coming back to eating and drinking? The explanation is exactly aligned with what we said before. Adarabba, to the contrary. What happens on Sukkot and Simchas Torah, Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres? We re-engage with the physical world. We eat and we drink. That's when you plug into Atzmus, because as we said before, from the perspective of Atzmus, there actually isn't a difference between having the spiritual experience of Yom Kippur or having the joyous and materialistic experience of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. And because it is a reflection of Atzmos, it's also a reflection of the essence of our own soul, which comes to the fore at that time. Now you might ask, we've already said before that the pleasure experienced in Yom Kippur is not composed out of a whole lot of different things that cause pleasure. It is an essence pleasure. What could Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres add to that? So that explanation will also be that will be based on what the Likutei Torah explains at the beginning of our parsha, which is that you've got the concept of chakika, of engraving, where the letters are one with the material on which the message is imparted. So we understand that the letters that have been engraved into the stone are not like ink that has been superimposed onto the stone. It's not something separate that's been added to the mix. It's now part of the stone. But everybody would agree that if you've got a beautiful gem, the engraving that you might make on the stone will never reach the value of the stone itself. Particularly when the stone has absolutely no engraving, no etching, nothing, just the pristine beauty of the stone itself. That will help us understand this question about Yom Kippur versus Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. We did say that the pleasure one achieves and experiences on Yom Kippur is a pleasure that is not composed by eating good food and having good drink, etc. It's just like at the essence of who we are. So that is that is similar to having letters etched into stone, which is a parable for the essence of Hashem, so to speak, etched into our neshama. It's all one thing. Two messages, so to speak, the message and the medium, all rolled into one. Whereas what we achieve on Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, that would be like just experiencing the stone without anything engraved on it. That is where we reach such a high level. We're talking about the essence of the soul itself, not the oisios, the various elements or descriptions or expressions of the soul itself. And finally, they will explain to us why first we're told Bechukosai Telechu, which speaks about the power of the neshama, Shorish HaNeshama, the fact that the neshama is, so to speak, engraved with godliness. And then what do we do? Not after, but beyond that, Bechukosai Tishmoru, we translate it into action. Bechukosai, like we said, is Bechinas Chakika. That represents how the message is engraved on our neshama. Where, as we said before, of course it's not like it's two separate things that have been bonded together. But we also said it's not as simple, as unadulterated as the stone itself. So therefore, whatever growth, whatever development, whatever unlimited opportunity for movement exists because of this dimension of the neshama. As we know, famously, we're way beyond Malachim because we can progress and they really can't. They're just kind of in a set orbit. But But as long as a person is operating only on the dimension of the neshama that is gifted from on high, the so-called bechor, the shorish neshama, the oisis hachakika, there's still limits. But when we start to do what the Eibishter wants, which is that we should fulfill mitzvahs, and we should do them with physical elements, bechinas on in the physical environment. Now we're directly linked into Hashem's essence, which is beyond messaging and beyond engraving the soul with Hashem's message. We're in the message. We're not thinking of the message. We're not dedicating ourselves to the message. We're in the message. That's where you really start to grow. That's where you really start to move without any restraint at all. As the Mishnah there says, that when you're in the environment of on, that's when you really can move and you really can elevate. Therefore, by going through the process of Bechukosai, which means moving in our Yiddishkeit because of the nature of our neshama, which is so linked into Hashem, and therefore is it's like the gift that Hashem gives us. And then we couple that yachad im our own efforts. In the physical limited world, the human endeavor. Then we reach the point that is described at the end of the parasha where Hashem says, "V'salachti b'soichechem," not b'soicham, b'soichechem. I will walk amongst you. It's a double expression implying beis bechinas hiluch. Two kinds of walking, two kinds of movement. The kind of movement that comes from on high towards us, and the kind of movement that comes from us towards Hashem. And the two will synthesize Hashem, which is why both types of movement, our movement towards Hashem and Hashem's movement towards us, are all represented by one word, one journey. In other words, this completely harmonious dual direction connection between us and Hashem. Until, as the parasha says, Hashem will lead us, so to speak, upright to Eretz Yisrael. To Kemis Pirusha Beis Komas, it's also a double word which implies two types of stature. Komas Hamashpia, but Komas Hamakabel. The stature of the influencer, Hashem, and the stature of the influence, the receiver, us. The same principle of Hashem reaching towards us and we reaching towards Him, and both of them incorporated into the same reality that you can't really distinguish between where Hashem is reaching out to us and us reaching out to Hashem. It is one reality. Because that will be the ultimate reward for all of our efforts to connect to the essence of our neshama and translate that into the actions that we do. So we'll reach this point where you no longer distinguish between what Hashem is giving us and what we're doing for Hashem. It becomes one singular unity. Even though it's something we can't necessarily comprehend, it will be revealed in the time of Mashiach, B'Karev Mamish. May that happen very speedily.